So I've just seen HBO's adaptation of The Last of Us, and honestly, I don't hate it. I was actually pretty surprised in how faithful certain scenes were to the original, and while some of the stuff they did add was questionable, to say the least, and of course there's some race swapping of characters, which I always enjoy, I'm not going to pretend that this first episode was terrible, it wasn't. So before we get into the breakdown, as you might expect, due to copyright reasons, I can't use a lot of clips from the show, so I'm only going to use them when necessary and have B-roll from some other game, and some clips from the original Last of Us where appropriate. So without further ado, let's get into the breakdown. The first scene is in 1968 as we see some kind of talk show talk about the threat of a global pandemic that could wipe out the human population, which no doubt they put this scene in here to relate the apocalypse to COVID. But as the second guest on the show points out, humans always win against viruses and bacteria in the end. But if a fungus were to mutate and attach to humans, much like a parasite, then we would all be fucked. Then the theme song plays, which rather surprisingly actually is the original theme from the game. That was a nice touch. And as we get to the first real scene of the show, you'll notice one major change immediately, that Sarah is now black. What does this add to the show? Why, absolutely nothing. But it doesn't stop there, as Joel is now Hispanic. And yes, I know, probably quite a few of you, especially those who never actually played The Last of Us, probably thought Joel was Hispanic. He kind of looks vaguely Hispanic, but as soon as you saw his brother Tommy, it was pretty obvious that he's not. And so we couldn't have that. Tommy is brown now. I can't wait for all the comments calling me a racist just for noticing shit. That surely never gets old. And another notable change is the prologue now takes place in 2003 instead of 2013, so that the quote-unquote present can be in 2023. And this entire intro section is full of fluff that wasn't in the game. We get to see Joel's neighbors, who are middle-aged, maybe a bit older, living with their invalid mother. We get to see Sarah go to school in Austin, Texas. And look, anyone who's played the game, which is probably going to be a significant amount of the people who watch this show, knows Sarah dies in the beginning, so all of this extra fluff doesn't really do anything but pad out the show. You could make the argument that it's here to make us care more about Sarah, but I really didn't. Partially because of the race swap, but also partially because they tried to go for a whole child prodigy thing. They don't lean into it super heavily, but it's there. She's clearly supposed to be the smart teenage girl while the adults are bumbling idiots. Except that in reality, she's not actually smart, as you'll see in a later scene. So of course, just like the game, it's Joel's birthday, and so for her father's birthday, she steals some of his money to go get his watch fixed. But of course, the outbreak is already starting, so she's rushed out of the store. The show doesn't explicitly explain what's going on, but obviously we all knew. The main point being Sarah doesn't know, and so she visits her neighbor's house, and the old invalid grandma starts acting strange. Obviously, somehow, she's infected. Now, this is already a problem you're gonna notice with the show. It doesn't come up in this episode, though some of us already know from an article that they've changed the main method of infection from spores, which makes sense given it's fungus, to now tendrils, which begs the question, how the hell did the grandma get infected, but not her son and his wife? And just like a generic horror movie, the dog starts whining, noticing that something's wrong with the grandma. Sarah heads home and notices there's jets flying overhead, still not setting off any alarm bells, I guess, in her head. Then later that night, the news starts talking about a series of violent incidents happening in the city, the news blaming it on some kind of new street drug. And here we actually get a somewhat decent retelling of a scene from the game where Sarah presents the fixed watch to her dad, but they kind of fucked up the cutesiness here. This is what I'm talking about. In the original scene in the game, this moment had to be heartwarming so that later when Sarah dies, we are far more emotionally impacted by it. But in this version, Sarah is just too snarky and doesn't act nearly as cute, so the landing was kind of botched here. I'm grateful that they actually took several direct scenes from the game, which you'll see over the course of this episode, but you'll notice a TV show from HBO, which is supposed to be higher quality, or at least they used to be, can't imitate a scene with the same amount of emotional depth as a game nearly a decade old. After Sarah is put to bed and wakes up a few hours later, once again more unnecessary fluff is added to the story as the neighbor's dog shows up acting strangely, and Sarah for some reason tries to drag the dog home, obviously doesn't want to go in the house, so obviously something is wrong. And like a generic shitty horror movie, she decides to see if something's wrong with the neighbor's house, which of course there is. The fucking grandma, who has now become a zombie, has eaten the other two residents of the house. And Sarah, like a fucking idiot, just stands there gawking. Eventually, she remembers she can run away, and Joel and Tommy show up to save her, kill the grandma zombie, and they make their way out of the neighborhood. Now, the next scene is an actually decently faithful recreation of the beginning of the game when they start driving into a town, which I'll never understand why they thought it was a good idea to drive into a town during a zombie apocalypse. But I'll try to play you a side-by-side comparison here. It was actually pretty cool to see this done so well. Eventually, a plane crashes behind them and a piece of shrapnel hits the car. It flips somehow off screen, and Joel now has to pick up his daughter and carry her, and you guys already know where this is going. Joel and Tommy are separated, and as Joel's running away, a zombie starts to chase him, and a military guy shoots the zombie, saving him, or so he thinks. And just like the game, the soldier is ordered to kill Joel and Sarah. And pretty much this whole thing is done 1-to-1, but once again, I just don't think it was done as well as the game. Part of it is the acting, but also part of it is just the lighting of the scene. In the original version, you could see Sarah's face clearly, and a tear is rolling down her face as she bleeds out. She's screaming. It's fucking brutal. I cried the first time I saw it. But this version, I don't know, it's kind of lacking something. It just feels a little cheaper, which is weird because, again, this was a PS3 game. Yes, it looked amazing for the time, but it's weird that, like, real fucking people couldn't sell it as well as the animation, I guess. So now we fast forward 20 years to the present, and I hope you like fluff because there's a whole lot more unnecessary scenes in this version. And yeah, that's to be expected. It's a TV show. Of course, they're gonna add a lot more little story details and change some things. Otherwise, what would be the point of making an adaptation? It starts off with a kid wandering to the outskirts of the quarantine zone. Fedra brings him in to some facility, and they sort of fool you into thinking, oh, maybe they're gonna cure him. But no, the kid's infected, they give him a lethal injection, and in the very next scene, we see Joel and Tess throw the kid's body in a fire. And yeah, actually that sets the tone pretty well for post-apocalypse America. Now, another problem I have is Tess's actress. I already complained in my remake of a remaster video that they aged up Tess like 20 fucking years or something and made her uglier, and the actress who plays her here is even a further step down from her remake model. I mean, what the fuck, man? Almost everyone in this show looks like they've been beaten with the ugly stick. It just doesn't fucking make sense. Just because there's an apocalypse doesn't mean all the attractive people died. In the next scene, we get to see a public execution for people attempting to leave the quarantine zone, which is a bit of a whiplash next to all the women who seem to be working for Fedra. And if for some reason you're wondering why I have a problem with this, I think it should be obvious. In a fucking apocalypse scenario, there's not gonna be any fucking diversity hires, there's not gonna be any virtue signaling. You're gonna hire the person who is the best for that job. Especially when it's the police or military of all things, you need that to be as strong as possible. Even in the apocalypse, we can't escape leftists, dude. In the next scene, we see Joel making a drug deal with one of the corrupt Fedra cops, trading some medication for some cigarettes. And the next scene is kind of bizarre, as we see Tess has been captured and beaten up by some goons, and it looks like she's being interrogated, but instead this beta male looking bad guy basically swindled her out of an engine that she tried to pay for, but he'd already sold it to someone else. But for some reason, he's trying to be a nice guy about it and ask her how to resolve it because he's scared of Joel. And then before they manage to come to an agreement, the wall explodes. Somehow the bad guy gets away. I guess he just runs or something. And the other people are dead, but Tess is completely fine. And we learn that the wall exploded because the Fireflies are a bunch of fucking psychos and just blow up shit. On the one hand, I can applaud them for sticking with the whole resistance not being a universal force of goodness, which is such a tired trope in media. But this is just a little bit too convenient. I don't know why they didn't just stick with the original plot from the game. I guess there wasn't enough money left in the budget for a shootout at this point, but yeah, if you remember the tutorial level from the original, yeah, that's completely cut out of this version. And the scene ends with Tess being arrested by Fedra because they think she's a Firefly. In the next scene, we're introduced to Ellie, and as you can imagine, this is the worst casting of the show by far. This fucking goblin, Bella Ramsey, you may remember her as one of the worst characters from the later Game of Thrones seasons, has now been cast as Ellie for some reason. And the problem is not that she's a terrible actress. I honestly think she was just fine here. It's just that her face is so fucking distracting. I don't know if she has fetal alcohol syndrome or Down syndrome, but she certainly has some issue of some kind. She doesn't look like a normal human being. And I'm certain I'm gonna make at least 1 or 2 more videos on this show, so I'll try not to bring that up too many more times. But please, for the love of God, stop putting this woman in anything. Once we get back to Joel again, we see what he traded the cigarettes for. He gives them to some underground communications guy who he's been using to communicate with Tommy, and Tommy has not responded in 3 weeks. And so Joel wants to travel to a radio tower in Wyoming himself to make sure his brother's alright. Then he heads home, digs out some old tools, charts out his path from Boston to the radio tower, has some drinks, takes a shit ton of meds, and finally heads off to sleep. Another interesting change here is Joel and Tess are clearly an item of some kind. It was sort of implied in the original, but you could argue it was purely platonic. Here they're shown sleeping together, there's no sex scene, but definitely a bit of intimacy. Honestly, I don't really care about this change either way. The next morning we finally get to what was essentially the first scene in the present in the original game, where Joel and Tess plot to get the battery back. And in the next scene, we see the Fireflies base, and they actually seem to be in pretty good shape compared to when you meet them in the game. And we get to see Marlene's spectacular leadership skills of, how about you follow your fucking orders?
My answer is to follow fucking orders.
Tell them to follow fucking orders.
Very inspiring. Now, honestly, her casting is pretty decent. It actually looks quite a bit like the character from the game, which already you might have had some feelings around the leader of a huge resistance group being a black woman, but also her second in command is also a black woman. At what point is this just straight up racial favoritism? I've heard people in Europe think that the population of African Americans in this country is something like 50% because that's the representation in our media. And as you already know, it's only 13%, and if you're taking just the women, that's 6.5%. And yet 3 somewhat significant characters in this show have been black women. Now Sarah obviously is mixed race, but the point still stands. Certainly high enough to make intelligent people start asking questions. The next couple scenes are mostly inconsequential. The first shows Joel and Tess discussing their plan of sneaking through the sewers to get into Robert's base. The next scene shows Marlene and Ellie having a one-on-one, just driving it home once again how important it is that Ellie is immune to the fungus. Then after that, Joel and Tess sneak through the sewers. They find a dead clicker, which is obviously a tease for them to show up later, but I don't even know why the thing is dead and fused to the wall. That's kind of weird. I don't really care enough to look into this, but wouldn't the last sewer maintenance person have to have been sent down there like months ago for this to have happened? And as the duo break into the base, they see a shootout has already gone down, and conveniently, pretty much all of the Fireflies and Robert's gang are dead, including Robert himself, with the only survivors being Marlene, the second in command, and Ellie. This is a really weird change from the game that doesn't really make sense to me, because you're essentially taking out a major scene showing Tess being a badass, maybe a little bit of a Mary Sue, I would argue, but she hasn't really done anything of note yet on the show. Whereas, at least for the first act of the game, she was a major player, could certainly hold her own, at least in a gunfight, and she humiliates and kills this slimy dude who betrayed her. And regardless of how I feel about the scene personally, it just doesn't make sense for the show to be more woke on other angles, but to also take out a female empowerment scene. I guess I'm just saying it's kinda stupid no matter how you look at it. And so, of course, just like the game, Marlene promises Joel all sorts of shit, all the stuff he needs and more, if he'll escort Ellie across the country, and of course he accepts. So the trio heads back home. We get a little moment that's supposed to show how smart Ellie is, as she figured out the secret radio code is based on what decade of music they'll play. And we actually get another pretty faithful retelling of a scene from the game as Joel lays down on the couch. I actually think the dialogue is one for one here. But yeah, I thought that was a really nice touch. The only reason I even recognized it is because of the remake remaster. But I guess if you're a super fan, you'll appreciate it that much more. Now the escape from Boston finally begins, and this is probably the most underwhelming retelling of the show, because basically all of the gameplay part of it was completely cut out, and it looks far less cinematic. If you remember, it was raining super hard, there were spotlights darting around the collapsed ground, and of course you had to sneak past as the searchlights went past you. In this version, they just kind of hide behind one car, crawl through a tunnel, and boom, the whole thing's done. And we get another kinda shitty recreation of the scene where Joel and Tess discover that Ellie is immune to the virus. As the dirty cop from earlier is there, but he's not going to accept any deal from Joel this time. And right as the three of them are about to get arrested, Joel has a flashback to when his daughter died, and so he beats the man to death. And Ellie reveals her bite mark. Joel and Tess don't seem to immediately believe it, but they keep moving anyway, and the episode ends as they venture off into the infected part of the city. Now, my immediate thoughts after viewing this episode was that, honestly, that was pretty decent. Then, honestly, the more I thought about it afterward, as I was giving you this little synopsis here, the more I realized how utterly pointless this adaptation is. When you think about it, this is a TV adaptation of a video game emulating a movie. So in other words, the original game was not made using the strengths of video games as an art form, aka the interactivity. Instead, wanting desperately to be respected by the film industry, Naughty Dog put most of their efforts into the storytelling. And while the story itself is kind of generic, how it was told was extremely well done for the time, certainly ahead of its time if you somehow consider modern gaming to be better than old games. The graphics were probably the best on the PS3, the animations were fantastic, the voice acting was surprisingly great, but the gameplay was just average, maybe a little above average. But instead of earning the respect of the film industry, not even of its own parent company, Sony, who decided to make an Uncharted movie instead of a Last of Us movie, we are instead stuck with an HBO show, which 10 years ago might have been awesome, but HBO is probably less than a shadow of its former self at this point, so I expect it to only get worse from here. And so honestly, there was no way they could have made this show and made it feel like it really added something to The Last of Us. And it doesn't help that we already had an unnecessary remake of an unnecessary remaster just a few months ago. And I know we're only one episode in, but the question stands, what does this adaptation add to The Last of Us? It didn't really add much more to the story, except a little bit of background to what happened to the Fireflies. But like I said, I didn't hate it. I think Pedro Pascal makes for a pretty good Joel. He's a good actor. Now, I do think he held back quite a bit on Joel's brutality. Yeah, he beat that one guy to death, and he suggested just running over some of the people during the apocalypse, but he doesn't seem nearly as angry as Joel was. So I hope he steps it up in the following episodes. Bella Ramsey, other than her being a goblin person, did a pretty good job, I guess. Though it seems like the writers made Ellie even more of a bitch in the show than she was in the game, but it's not like she had that many lines, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. And I feel cautious about complimenting the show for being entertaining because all of the entertaining stuff was from The Last of Us, but it's not like I was bored while watching it and I didn't hate it like I did Halo and Resident Evil, so I'm trying my hardest here to look for compliments. But as it stands right now, this is actually a pretty decent adaptation outside of the race swapping. That's really the huge alarm bells ringing off. This will no doubt be more woke than the original game, and the original game was pretty woke for its time, but it was before Gamergate or any of that huge culture war shit, so people didn't point it out as much back then. So the question is, would I recommend you watch it? Only if you didn't play the remake of the remaster and for some reason you want to see uglier actors play the roles of animated characters and there be very little action outside of the initial zombie apocalypse. But I will be reviewing the rest of the series, not episode by episode, because that shit just gets old after a certain point, but I'll probably do 2 to 3 episodes at a time, especially since there's other games to talk about this month, like Forspoken, which I may or may not skip, and the Dead Space remake. So that's about it. I'll see you next time, guys.